Thank you very much, Professor Burden. Yeah, it's really the comprehensive and scientific data-oriented analysis. And Professor Ono, could you kindly give us your comments?
Yeah, thank you for giving a great talk and very interesting. Thank you for showing very interesting results. And I have some questions that I want to ask. The first thing is about mobilization of voters. During the Obama campaign, I saw that the young people and Black voters are very active in mobilization, and to some extent, Clinton campaign didn't fully mobilize those voters. And I'm curious how they are doing, especially young voters, maybe having a difficult time, at the college campuses, for example, they cannot actively engage in campaign due to the pandemics. So I'd like to hear about mobilization of voters and those young voters and the Black voters, their activities and the engagement in the campaign.
Yeah, this is a good question. It has been very difficult for the campaigns to do the traditional work they want to do of what we call get out the vote, or GOTV, and mobilizing supporters. The Democrats especially have decided to stop all face-to-face campaigning, essentially. So Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are not doing rallies. Their volunteers are not going door to door, visiting homes, handing out literature, knocking on doors, or attending public events like a fair or a festival where they might distribute literature or find supporters. So the Democrats have relied more on digital communication and digital advertising. Joe Biden has been raising lots of money, so he has plenty of money to invest in those things, and lots of volunteers who are trapped at home during the pandemic and want something to do to work on the campaign. They are allowing those volunteers to do texting of people who are on their list of supporters or to make phone calls. So much more of that happening this time around. And conveniently, the young voters the Democrats want to reach are reachable on digital technologies. Older voters are not as reachable. But young Democrats are telling us in surveys that they are hearing from the Democratic campaign, and it's mostly by text, email, or some other digital communication. Republicans are using a more traditional mix of phone calls and mail, and even some face-to-face campaigning. Trump has been doing rallies until he was diagnosed with COVID last week. He was visiting many states, and his volunteers are going door to door, visiting people's homes with some safety precautions in place, but they really believe they need to do that kind of activity to find their supporters. So each campaign is going at it somewhat differently. I think the Democrats do want to make sure they don't make the same mistakes that Hillary Clinton made 4 years before. You mentioned Black voters in particular, who were not mobilized in the same way as they were when Obama was the candidate. Some of that was their enthusiasm for Obama. Seeing a Black candidate as the nominee of the party was energizing for the Black community, but also his campaign emphasized community organizing on the ground. And Hillary Clinton didn't have either of those things. She wasn't a Black candidate, and she didn't work the campaign on the ground in the same way. Democrats have decided they're going to fix as many of those things as they can. And I think there's more enthusiasm, more genuine enthusiasm for Joe Biden because he was the vice president to Barack Obama. And so there's that connection that creates warmer feelings for Black voters. And among young voters, there's so much dislike of Donald Trump that they seem quite eager to vote, even though they're not especially fond of Joe Biden. In the surveys my center has done, we ask people who they're going to vote for. And then we ask, are you voting for that person because you want to support them or because you want to vote against the other candidate? The Donald Trump supporters tell us they are voting for him because he is their preferred candidate. They're really enthusiastic about him. They don't care who the opponent is. Joe Biden's voters tell us they're not great fans of Joe Biden. They really want to get rid of Trump. So that has brought the Democratic Party together, despite all of their differences about policy and identity and other things. That common goal of wanting to remove Trump and him being the incumbent is really helping the Democrats produce the kind of energy they need on the ground.
Thank you. And maybe like related to that, like so this time so election will be held during the pandemic, and I guess many voters don't want to go polling place to cast their own ballot, and I assume that the many voters actually send up their ballot by mail. So I'm curious about the impact of like a mail-in ballot. That there is debate on the validity, or like Trump also showed some concerns about mail-in ballot, and I'm curious about uh, the impact of the pandemic in terms of like a mail-in ballot, and like people's concern about going to a polling booth.
Yeah, there are quite a few things to say about this. So, first of all, voting by mail has been used in some way in the United States since the mid 1800s, particularly for soldiers who were away from home. They were given the ability to vote absentee by sending a ballot back by mail. But it's really only been in the last 20 years or so that voting by mail has become very popular. And there actually are several states that have done all of their balloting by mail for the last few election cycles. Now, what's interesting is in those states, the ballots go out by mail automatically, but they can be returned by the voter in different methods. So some voters do mail them back, but actually most voters prefer to bring them back in person, either handing them off to an election worker or putting them in a drop box or leaving them at an office or someplace. That has changed during the pandemic because voters don't want to have those face-to-face interactions. And even in states that did not do voting by mail, suddenly a majority of voters want to vote by mail. It has forced states to try to change their election systems to accommodate it by providing drop boxes or working out new relationships with the Postal Service or providing drive-up voting opportunities. But there will be many ballots returned by mail. I think there's a real risk in doing that because in previous elections, between 1% and 2% of mail ballots are not counted because of something that goes wrong with mailing in that ballot. Either the ballot doesn't ever get back to the election office because the Postal Service fails to deliver it, or it gets back too late, and so it's rejected because the voter missed the deadline, or the voter forgets to put on their signature on the envelope, or in some states like mine, the voter also has to get the signature of another person who witnesses the vote. And so if that is missing, the ballot can be rejected. Also, if the ballot envelope is not sealed, it can be rejected. If a voter makes a mistake on the ballot by voting for 2 candidates rather than 1, it can be rejected. So there are lots of ways the process can go wrong. And this year, many people will be voting by mail for the first time ever. And it tends to be the new voter who makes these kinds of mistakes because it's a foreign process for them. So I do think the Democrats are taking some risk by putting so much attention and so much effort into voting by mail because some of their voters' ballots will not be counted. But there really is a partisan divide this year. As you hinted, Democrats want to vote by mail. Their leaders are telling them to vote by mail. They will vote by mail at very high rates. Maybe 60 or 70% of Democratic voters will cast ballots by mail. Republicans are more mixed. Many of them wish to vote by mail. They like the convenience of it, and they feel unsafe going to a public polling place and waiting in line. But the president has disparaged absentee voting and voting by mail and says it's not safe, that it's rife with fraud, and that his voters ought to vote in person. And so I think for some Republicans, they view it as a point of pride to vote in person. They want to show that they are tough, that they are voting with their president, they're standing with their president. In the way that President Trump has showed he is tough after getting the COVID virus, his voters want to show that they can fight through the virus and vote in person just the way they always have. That also comes with risks because on election day, some of his supporters might decide they don't feel comfortable going to a polling place. So this is a brand new divide in the way people vote that didn't exist before the pandemic. Before the pandemic, Democrats and Republicans voted about equally by mail. And if anything, Republicans were a little more likely to vote by mail than Democrats were within states. So the division of preferences, I think, has really politicized an issue of election administration that had not gotten a lot of attention before. And unfortunately, it's made it one of the issues in the campaign, how we vote. is now one of the topics that voters care about. And so it's really complicated things.
Thank you. And so this time, vice presidential candidate is Kamala Harris, who is a woman in Democratic side. And we will have a vice presidential debate sometime soon. I'm curious about the impact of having a female vice presidential candidate in Democratic side on elections.
Yeah, it's a good question. She's not only female, but she's also of mixed ancestry, having one parent from the Caribbean and one from India. And that makes her, I think, her appeal different than other female candidates. There have been other female candidates on the presidential ticket. Well, Hillary Clinton ran for president at the top of the ticket, but also in 2008, Sarah Palin was the running mate to John McCain. And back in 1984, Geraldine Ferraro was the first woman on a major party candidate. So I think voters have gotten somewhat used to seeing a woman on the ticket in one form or another, but none of those were successful. There has never been a female president or female vice president. I do think the vice presidents are getting more attention this year because both presidential candidates are older. They're both in their 70s, which in the United States is old for a presidential candidate. Joe Biden would be the oldest president ever. He would turn 80 in his first term. And the virus puts them at risk. They are in risky categories, and Donald Trump today has the virus. So I think there's more attention on who the running mates would be. I don't think most of the public knows much about Kamala Harris. Really their only exposure to her was at the Democratic National Convention, where she gave a good speech, but that was watched by a small number of people. So I think the debate is a place where she will get to introduce herself to more people, and so that's a way for, I think, her exposure to come to matter more. I don't know, if voters are reluctant to see a woman in the White House, they may also be reluctant to vote for a vice presidential candidate because it is so likely that she will become president. That is a very common path to the presidency. And especially because Joe Biden has sort of hinted that he would not run for 2 terms. If he was elected, he would probably serve 1 term and then hand it off to someone else. She would be the natural person to hand it off to as his vice president. So that may be on voters' minds and may cause them to be a little more cautious about voting for the Democratic ticket if they don't feel entirely comfortable with having a woman as president. So I think it's an interesting factor. It's one of many things going on this year. It has not gotten a lot of attention yet, but I think with the president having the virus, it's probably going to get more attention in the coming days.
Thank you so much. Right, so that's all I have. Do you have any other questions on the floor?
If I may, thank you very much, Professor Braden. It was very insightful analysis. I very much appreciate that. My question is, if we focus on 6 tipping states to win the electoral vote, what will be the deciding factors main factors to decide voters' behaviors? In other words, what will be factors to flip voters who voted for Trump in 2016?
Yeah, so let's focus on those states, maybe the 3 key swing states of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan that Trump won so narrowly. I think there are a few key groups to look at in each of those states. One group are the people who voted for third-party candidates or independent candidates in 2016. There were some significant third-party candidates on the ballot. Jill Stein was a candidate of the Green Party. William Weld was a candidate and his running mate Gary Johnson were the ticket for the Libertarians. There was also a conservative candidate who ran in many states. And together they got about 6% of the vote. So that meant that Clinton and Trump together got the other 94%, and that prevented Donald Trump from winning a majority of the vote in any of these states. So he won Wisconsin and Ohio and Michigan and others, but without winning 50% of the vote. This year, he will need 50% of the vote because the third-party candidates are going to be much smaller in their presence. What's going to happen to those third-party voters? Where do they go? I think that's an important part of the vote mix this year. Again, in the surveys that my center has done, we've tracked those voters who supported third-party candidates. This year, they are saying they are likely to vote for Joe Biden by a margin of almost 2-1. So they are now mostly Democratic voters, at least for 2020. And because they comprise 6% of the vote, that's a very large share going to Biden. And that is what puts him over the top in some of these key states. He's running about as well with Democrats as Clinton did 4 years ago. Trump is doing about as well with Republicans as he did 4 years ago. So it is these new voters and third-party voters that seem to be giving Biden at least part of his early advantage. So I think that's a key group to watch. Those voters tend to be younger and not very attached to the political system, not very engaged. That's why they found the third parties attractive. They were looking for something different. Now Trump is the president. Although he's an unusual president, they are looking for something that's not him, and Joe Biden offers that as the challenger. So I think that's a key group. Another group Professor Ono mentioned are African-American voters, and they are very important, especially in some larger urban areas like the cities of Milwaukee and Detroit and Philadelphia, big cities in the Midwest, where higher levels of Black turnout will help the Democrats because African-Americans vote for Democratic candidates at about a rate of 90%. So every additional African-American voter who turns out is helpful to the Democrats trying to build a majority. And I do think the Democratic campaigns have invested in trying to turn out the Black vote in a way, at least in my state, that the Democrats did not 4 years ago. That's not the same pattern in every state, but it's an important focus. And I think Black voters are energized, but it is always a question what the turnout level will be. And it's so important to the Democrats that even small changes there can matter. And then I think a third group to watch are voters who live in rural communities. Rural voters supported Donald Trump very strongly in 2016, more than they had other Republicans, especially rural voters with lower levels of education, people who had not gone to college. They were very strongly supportive of Donald Trump, and they turned out at much higher rates than they had in the past. It looks like they're not going to be as supportive this time around. Over the last few years, we've seen in midterm elections and in polling, rural voters moving back to the Democrats just a little bit, maybe just enough to cost Trump the election. So, all of these are kind of small factors of a few percentage points here and there. But because Trump's victory in these tipping states was so narrow 4 years ago that he can't afford to have these various losses, they will add up in a way that right now looks like he could lose a lot of the tipping point states by 5 or 6 or 7 percentage points, which would be pretty bad losses in states that are supposed to be battlegrounds.
Thank you very much. If I may, on your last point on the behavior of rural voters in the key states, so what is the main reason why this time they are a bit maybe reluctant to vote for Trump? Is that a performance of economic policy or pandemic or any other factors?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's other factors. I think much of it is frustration that led them to support Trump 4 years ago that has not been satisfied over the last 4 years. The things that attracted rural voters to Trump 4 years ago were his message about wanting to shake up Washington and fix government and drain the swamp. I think many of them felt as though Washington was not in touch with their needs and not listening to them and not respecting them. And so they like that language. He has not fully delivered on that in their view. He is now part of Washington, and so it's harder to say he's going to go clean it up. He is now governing Washington and overseeing the government. So I think it's harder to make that kind of argument. And he's been involved in some scandals of his own, including an impeachment. So he's not the outsider candidate that he was 4 years ago. Rural voters were also frustrated by the cost of healthcare. Healthcare access and the cost of healthcare are very problematic in rural areas. There are not as many hospitals and healthcare providers as there should be. There are very limited options for purchasing healthcare. And the Affordable Care Act, or what's known as Obamacare, has been law for 10 years, or it had been for about 6 years at the time of the election, but it wasn't working for rural voters. A lot of the rural healthcare providers were closing down. And actually, just before the 2016 election, the new Obamacare rates, the new premium rates were announced, and they were higher. The cost is going up each year. And that really frustrated rural voters. Donald Trump said he was going to go to Washington and dismantle the Affordable Care Act and build a healthcare system that was better. So that was appealing to those voters, but he obviously hasn't built the new healthcare system. His administration has been tearing down the Affordable Care Act through both executive action and legislation and in the courts where he's suing to undo the Affordable Care Act. But he hasn't really developed or proposed a specific plan that would fix it. So I think that leaves rural voters in sort of a difficult place, that they're not happy with Obamacare or what's left of it. They're not happy with what Trump has done on healthcare. Joe Biden is offering something different, a kind of enhancement of the Affordable Care Act that might be appealing. So I think they're open to that message. And then finally, a third thing, especially in farming communities, is the trade relationships with the rest of the world, which were frustrating farmers who produce crops or milk and dairy, and were trying to export it. They were suffering from low prices and not enough demand, and the difficulties of being small business people. Trump has satisfied that in some ways. He's dismantled the North American Free Trade Agreement and replaced it with a new agreement with Canada and Mexico, but he's also been engaged in trade wars with China and other countries, and those have not been solved. So I'm not sure that there have been enough improvements in trade relationships that farm communities really feel as though they are better off. I think they're waiting to see whether this leads to some better relationships, but they haven't materialized just yet, and the pandemic has made it more complicated. So I think Trump's troubles with rural voters really started before the pandemic and started before the racial protests, and really have to do with the kinds of things he promised 4 years ago that just have not materialized in a way that's satisfying for a lot of rural voters. And that leads them to, I think, at least be interested in voting for Biden, even if a majority of them don't.
Thank you very much for very professional analysis. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have one question.
Yes, please.
I was very impressed by your figure about Clinton's volatility of Clinton's support rate. That was very impressive, I thought. And it reminded me that the lots of factors, outside factors or information control factors, like Cambridge Analytica, and like maybe Russian intervention, and there were lots of people who tried to intervene through the internet and through the informational system to change the election result. And this has been made kind of clear that at least among the Democratic side or among the ordinary governmental bureaucracy and so on, that they made it clear that the Russian meddling existed, the Cambridge Analytica issue existed, and it was not unreal. Now, and finally, I think what made the last election's final result turned around was the James Comey's treatment of the Russian meddling. And I think that was very critical a few days before the election was held. They had this revelation that Clinton may have tampered the emails. Now, my question is if there is any possibility of similar kind of informational interventions from here through the election days. It seems very critical. And as you know, that the Antifa is kind of prohibited. I think I hear today the Facebook decided not to publish Antifa's, not Antifa, I'm sorry, QAnon's emails. But still, President Trump talks about Antifas, and he was very suggestive about the important roles of the Proud Boys. And all those informational things which manipulate people, there seems to be still a chance that could play a role determining the election. I would like to see what your view is about this point.
Yes, it's a good point. There will be disinformation campaigns this year. There already are disinformation campaigns. Some of them are coming from the Russian government or are sponsored by Russian actors. I think the intelligence community has already confirmed that is happening. It looks somewhat different than 4 years ago, but it is happening on social media and elsewhere. There are also efforts from, I think, the Iranian government and the Chinese government to sow some disinformation, not necessarily to hack the election, but to create discord and confusion and lack of confidence. So those things will continue to happen. I don't think Facebook and Twitter and other social media companies are doing a good job of containing that. I think it's very challenging for them. Facebook is doing things like banning paid advertising in the week after the election while we wait for the results to be tabulated. Well, in my view, paid advertising is not the problem. I would prefer to have paid advertising, which is transparent. You can know who paid for the ad. The trouble is the material that looks like it's organic that's coming up in the social media feed that has been created by some actor outside the country. So that's likely to continue. And I think Facebook and other companies try to stomp out these fires as they emerge, but they're not going to prevent all of it from happening. Now, I do think the effect will be different this year, though, because most of that activity 4 years ago worked to Hillary Clinton's disadvantage, right? The Russian actors were more supportive of Donald Trump than of Hillary Clinton. But also it raised questions about Hillary Clinton, about her missing emails. There were 33,000 emails that were deleted that President Trump talked about a lot. There was her connection to the Clinton Foundation, which is the nonprofit attached to her husband. There were speeches that she gave that were paid to speak to wealthy bankers and others, and those were secretive, and the speeches were never released, and they were a point of questioning. And then there was the Jim Comey letter, as you mentioned, and all of that stuff, I think, fed into a narrative that Trump was offering, that she is not trustworthy. She doesn't have your interests in mind as a voter. She doesn't care about you. She is secretive and deceptive, and she's part of the swamp in Washington that needs to be removed. I don't think that message is going to work on Joe Biden in the same way. Joe Biden's favorability ratings in surveys are higher than Hillary Clinton, so the public likes him more. He does not have the baggage or the scandals that could be the subject of disinformation campaigns. And where Trump has tried to tag him with those things, like the stories about Hunter Biden and the Burisma company, it hasn't worked. Trump raises it in speeches and at the debates, and it just has not taken hold. The media don't cover it. Voters don't seem interested. They don't know who Hunter Biden is. They don't care much. So I think the disinformation campaigns will still be there, and the use of voter data, and like the Cambridge Analytica example you gave, those kinds of things are still happening, but I don't think they're going to be as effective, which again is trouble for Trump, because he needed all of those things to come together in just the right combination to let him win the election. And so without those things having the same impact, without third-party candidates, without, with him being the incumbent, there's just a variety of things that make this election so much more difficult for Trump.
Well, thank you very much. The last time all the anti-election campaign from probably the rest of the world was a big surprise, and I really didn't know that somebody can do that back in 2016. So I think it was a clear surprise, and while I was being surprised, so many of things came from Russia, and I forgot the name. But in any case, all those hackers information, that all those data hacked by the Russian or somebody else, and that was a huge surprise to me. And I would like to know your view about whether or not the maybe American people in general, or at least American media and American government, became more aware and more immune to that kind of informational intervention of your opinion and intervention about controlling the public opinion from the rest of the world. I wonder to what extent this is achieved for over the 4 years.
Yes, I do think many Americans were surprised by what happened in 2016. We're not aware of what was happening until after the election. The thing that made social media efforts effective is that they were deceptive. Americans who were on Facebook and saw postings didn't realize they were coming from Russian actors. They were messages about Black Lives Matter or about Jill Stein or other factors. And so they had this kind of hidden quality to them. So I think the public has learned over time about those things. And the Senate Intelligence Committee here has done a series of bipartisan reports that have been very good. I've gotten a lot of attention, and I've actually shown the public examples of Facebook posts that were deceptive and were probably illegal, paid for by Russian actors in rubles, paying Facebook in order to place things or sponsor different kinds of posts. I think also the efforts to try to infiltrate the election infrastructure, the election administration system, those have also become more apparent. Again, the intelligence community did some reporting on this. The good thing is that election officials in the US have spent most of the last 4 years trying to harden the election infrastructure system. Before the pandemic, that was the focus. Election officials didn't know the pandemic was coming and they would have to deal with a huge increase in mail voting. Instead, they were figuring out how to protect the voter registration database in every state, or how to protect websites, or how to ensure that phishing attempts or malware or ransomware were not used to hijack election systems. So they've implemented two-factor authentication to log into email systems. They've implemented logging of voter registration databases so they can see whenever a change is made, who has made it, and if there was a bad actor who made a change that was not acceptable, they could roll it back to some previous stage. They've introduced sensors that will track bad actors trying to infiltrate servers. They've provided more secure websites. So there's been a huge amount of improvement. It has not been supported by Donald Trump. He has been dismissing Russian influence for 3 years, but his administration has been very helpful. The Department of Homeland Security has been very helpful to the states, traveling to each state and helping them implement these protections. So I feel much more comfortable that the election system has the right protections in place. But I think the disinformation campaigns are harder to confront. As long as you have a free society with open technology, open borders, we have a First Amendment that really protects free speech in a way that the courts and government are not willing to constrain. And the social media companies need users and need people to use them, so they're not likely to want to restrain the use of those tools. Those things I think don't go away, and they will be different this time. I was surprised to hear how much the Russians have been involved in other countries' elections before they were involved in the United States in 2016. They weren't, the Russians and some Ukrainians were involved in the Brexit vote. UK. They were involved in the French elections. They were involved in some Eastern European elections. So they're very flexible, and they're willing to try different things and to put resources. They don't know what will work. This is sort of like terrorism. You don't know what will work, and you in defending yourself, you have to be imaginative. What could be done? And so it's very hard to see ahead of time. We're fighting the last war by trying to fix the things from 2016, but there are likely to be some different elements this time around.
I think you're right, and I think you probably seen the New York Times article on the Russian intervention in Sweden. I think there was a Sweden or Norway. There was a good article on the Russian intervention in election over many years, and I think both Europeans and Americans are learning about how to defend themselves against this kind of things, and I think that's very important from here on further to learn how to deal with this kind of problems.
Yeah, and the United States is a big diverse, pluralistic country. So there are a lot of small subpopulations that can be persuaded by a message that's targeted at their interests. And the election system is not a national election system. It is 50 state election systems. And even within states, each county or city will have its own way of running elections. So that provides a lot of points of entry
Right.
where a bad actor can try to reach a group or burrow into a state like Florida or Wisconsin to try to have some influence. So it is a permeable system, even with all these protections in place. It just has some vulnerabilities that I think other countries don't have.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Any other questions?
So this time, like many discrediting Donald Trump come from like a Republican side, like the case of like the Lincoln Project, for example. I'm a bit surprised to see like those activities, like defections from the party. I'm curious about why this happens and what could what could affect like elections at the other offices on the Republican side.
Yeah, it's very unusual for these groups to peel off and oppose the president. It's not just the Lincoln Project, as you mentioned. There are former officials from previous Republican administrations, their previous office holders. I think several former chairs of the Republican National Committee, maybe 6 out of the last 7 chairs of the Republican National Committee have come out endorsing Joe Biden. So it's very unusual. I think it's an indicator of how much the Republican Party has changed in 4 years. The kind of establishment Republicans who were familiar to us, people like the Bushes, are gone from the Republican Party. They don't exist. They have left office or been defeated. A lot of Republican senators who were moderates have now left office. I think Mitt Romney is an exception to that, and he's giving the president trouble. I don't know if he has said how he will vote in this election, but most of the moderate Republican senators who would have opposed Trump have now left. And so it's really Trump's party. It's not a traditional Republican party. It doesn't have a platform that looks like the old, well, they actually didn't write a platform this year. They just accepted the platform from 4 years ago. So policy is not the main interest. It's really organized around this person. And that's not how American political parties are normally organized. They are around groups or ideas, building coalitions, but this instead is really kind of centered around one individual. You know, it probably has some effect, these efforts like the Lincoln Project probably have some effect at the remaining people who think of themselves as old style Republicans, but have just never been comfortable with Donald Trump. Maybe some suburban voters who I think were not fully supportive of Trump 4 years ago, the way they had been for other Republicans. The messages sort of get to them. And Lincoln Project has been using social media very effectively, you know, to sort of work their way in through free sharing of these kinds of things, but also paid ads. Yeah, if Trump wins, it will not be because of help from the Republican Party. It will be because he and his most hardcore supporters who have now infiltrated the Republican National Committee work so effectively together that they managed to just make it happen. You know, it's strange. But his election 4 years ago was also strange. He was not cooperating with the Republican Party. They were not, you know, congruent in their activities, their fundraising, the offices they opened on the ground in different states were not linked in any meaningful way. And he talked about running against the Democratic Party and running against the Republican Party to get the nomination, and then in the general election, and running against the media. So he views all of those as his opponents. You even heard this in the debate last week where he said, I have to debate Joe Biden and I also have to debate the moderator, Chris Wallace. So it has kind of become part of his brand or his strategy for all of these to be his opponents. So for his core supporters, I think that message kind of resonates. They like that he's combative and he's different. but it's hard to win a big general election when you need your party to come together and be supportive. Right now, surveys are showing Republicans are very supportive. Probably 95% of people who call themselves Republicans in surveys and vote will vote for Trump. But their turnout levels may be lower because they feel some ambivalence about him.
Yeah, I can easily imagine that many Republican candidates running for House and Senate have a difficult time in creating their own platforms. Because it's hard.
You know, it depends on the state whether Trump is helpful or harmful. And this came up when he nominated Amy Coney Barrett for the Supreme Court. The Senate has to vote on that nomination. The question was, is this going to help Republican senators who are trying to run for re-election? I think it depends on the state. So I mentioned some of these Senate races that are very competitive this year. In a state like Colorado, the Republican senator is Cory Gardner. He is hurt by all of this because he's living in a blue state trying to win re-election. Everything Trump does just harms his chances more. And now that there's a Supreme Court nomination as part of all the campaign ideas that are floating around, the Democratic voters in Colorado don't want Cory Gardner to stay in the Senate and to vote on the Supreme Court or anything else. So that probably hurts him. But there are a few other states where it probably helps the Republican a little bit. In a state like Georgia, which is a swing state this year, you have 2 Senate races going on. One of the Republicans is running ads showing how similar she is to Donald Trump, trying to prove that she is like Trump. So, you know, she's asking voters, if you like Trump, you should like me because I'm like him. So there are candidates who are trying to use that to their advantage. If the state leans red, as Georgia does, they think it may help them. It's working that way a little bit in Iowa also, where the Republican incumbent knows that Trump won her state by a lot last time. And she doesn't mind being associated with him, trying to get the good parts of that and then distance herself at times. So they're trying to have it both ways, but that gets hard to do as you get closer to election day because partisanship just becomes so intense.
Thank you very much, Professor Burden, for the answering the very wide range of the questions. Okay, so let me close today's webinar. Thank you very much, Professor Burden and Professor Ono, for the joining today and organizing today's session. Yes, I really appreciate it. So we are expecting you coming to Japan next in the near future. Okay, this is the RDT channel, and please stay tuned and please subscribe. Thank you.